Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Classical Greece, the Golden Age. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to see the fallout from the Persian Wars. What happens when Greece wins its biggest victory ever? And that, of course, is the ushering in of kind of the highlight, the peak of Greek civilization, even though it lasts a very short time. So what we'll end up doing is we'll set the scene, see how we got to this point. From there, we're going to take a look at the Golden Age, what that means culturally. Then we'll see that even though things are looking really, really good culturally, there are still political tensions between some of the major city-states in ancient Greece. And finally, we'll wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. Now, to set the scene, of course, we're starting way back in the Bronze Age, around 3000 BC, and for nearly 2,000 years, we get the rise of complexity, the rise of civilization. That starts to come to an end in the Dark Ages, where for 400 years, we see the collapse of complexity, smaller buildings, smaller settlements, poorer burials, less sophisticated art. And in the 8th century BC, that all begins to change, where we start to see iconographic art again. We start to get monumental buildings. We get those stone temples that Greece is so famous for, and that black figure pottery that we associate with classical Athens. Now, we saw at the very end of the Archaic period, Greece gets embroiled in a giant war with the Persians, and this is bad news for the Greeks. The Greeks are a series of small independent city-states, whereas Persia is the greatest empire the world has ever seen. But somehow, some way, the Greeks are able to bait the Persians into a, well, not so intelligent naval battle from the Persian perspective, and by defeating the Persian fleet, the Persians are no longer able to support their army, and the Greeks are able to kick the Persians out of the Greek homeland. Now, on the very same day the Greeks have won that battle, the Battle of Salamis, they've also defeated the Carthaginians 1,000 miles away over on the island of Sicily. And so here we see the Syracusans and the citizens of Acrogos team up to defeat Hamilcar I of Carthage at the Battle of Himera. And so we've seen a huge victory over the Persians, we've seen a huge victory over the Carthaginians, and what we get now is this period in Greece that we call the classical period. So even though things like temples and pottery and stuff like that, we kind of all associate with classical Greek culture, historically it's this very specific time from 480 BC, right after the Persian Wars, to 323 BC with the death of Alexander the Great. So let's take a look at what this entails culturally, right? What does the Golden Age or the classical period mean culturally in Greece? Well, for one, we see the evolution of Greek philosophy. So earlier on, we get that kind of Ionian Enlightenment, where people start to ask questions about why the world works the way it does. Can we explain natural phenomenon without referencing the gods? In the classical period, we see the rise of the most famous of Greek philosophers. So we see Socrates, who starts asking this question of what knowledge is and how people should behave. So moving on from just natural phenomena to how we as humans should act in the world. We see the rise of Plato, and actually all the writings of Socrates, right? Socrates himself didn't write anything down. Everything we have about Socrates comes from his student Plato. And what Plato says is that the world is made up of these kind of perfect forms. But we can't really know what those perfect forms are, but our kind of quest to understand those things, that's getting us closer and closer to what knowledge truly is. And then finally, we get Aristotle down the road. Aristotle was actually the tutor of Alexander the Great. And Aristotle's one of these guys who's a true Renaissance man. So he's a philosopher and a mathematician and a physicist and an astronomer, not just kind of philosophizing about the way that we should act, but also, once again, trying to figure out scientifically the way the world works. We also see kind of further development in the artistic realm. So in the Archaic period, we saw the rise of kind of life-size and even monumental human form sculpture. And so these are kind of good examples of what archaic sculpture looks like. You can clearly tell it's a person. They're kind of idealized. They're looking pretty buff, but they're very rigid, 1 foot forward. They kind of always have the same facial expression. When we get to the classical period, what we end up seeing is we see that sculpture becomes a little bit more realistic, a little bit more idealistic, and a little bit more fluid as well. What we see is that people move away from being super rigid, and now all of a sudden there's all this movement in the sculptural form. All right, and what we see here are the Parthenon, or what some people call the Elgin marbles, what many people think are the kind of pinnacle of classical Greek sculpture. And these would have been found on the outside of the Parthenon, and they tell the story of what we call the Pan-Athenaic procession. This kind of this procession through the city of Athens to bring Athena, this huge statue of Athena, a new garment and kind of renew her protection over the city. Now, so those were found on the Parthenon, not on the very outside here, but there would have been an interior wall where those sculptures would have been. But we also see kind of along here, right, we get the Parthenon as one of the major developments of classical Greece. So after the Acropolis had been burned by the Persians, so remember when the Greeks retreat from Athens down to the Isthmus of Corinth, they allow the Persians to go ahead and burn the city. And they burn everything on the Acropolis. There used to be a previous temple to Athena up there. It gets totally destroyed. But what this means is that when the Greeks win the battle, they have kind of a blank canvas for rebuilding. And what they do is they build a series of classical structures on the Acropolis, mostly with religious functions, that stand as some of the best examples of classical Greek architecture, the Parthenon being kind of the main one. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at the Athenian Acropolis and see what's going on with classical Greek architecture. So the Acropolis itself, remember this is the Greek word for the high point of the city. Very literally it means the high city. And you can see here just how literally that's true for Athens. It's a very, very sharp kind of rocky outcropping in the middle of the city. And here what we're looking at is a plan of the Acropolis. So we can see this theater of Dionysus on the side, the later Odeon of Herodes Atticus also kind of built into the side of the hill. And then these are the structures that are on top. And a visitor to the Acropolis would kind of wind their way over here and eventually enter this thing that we call the PROPYLAEA. And this is a shot of what the PROPYLAEA actually looks like. And so what you see here, this is essentially a monumental entranceway to the Acropolis. So kind of a very memorable way to enter this sacred and religious space. We can see that it's got a couple different styles of architecture. We can see the Doric style here with these kind of bowl-shaped capitals. And then on the interior, we see the volutes, the scroll-like capitals that indicate the Ionic style of architecture. Now, once you get through the PROPYLAEA over here, you kind of enter the main part of the Acropolis. But before doing so, you can look off to the right, see this little building here, and this is what we call the Temple of Athena Nike. Now, it's a small little thing. It's perched on the very, very edge of the Acropolis. You can see it overlooking the modern city of Athens here. But this is really important for us as one of the kind of best examples of Ionic religious architecture in the city of Athens. And so once again, the way you can tell is you can look at the capitals. You can see these little scroll-like volutes, right, on top of the columns. And when you look down at the base of the column, you see that it doesn't sit directly on the platform here, but there's a little base to the column itself. The other thing we see is that it's the Temple of Athena Nike. And what this means to us is that the gods and goddesses of the ancient Greek world tend to have different forms. So Athena, even though she's kind of this warrior goddess, right, she can have different versions of herself. And this one in particular is dedicated to Athena, the goddess of victory. And so when you wear Nike shoes, right, you're kind of dedicating your feet to Athena, the goddess of victory as well. Same kind of word. Now, once we've passed through the PROPYLAEA and then passed by the Temple of Athena Nike, we're now in the center of the Acropolis. And we can see the largest building that we've got, and that is the titular Parthenon. Now, when we say the word Parthenon, the reason we call it the Parthenon is because it's a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena Parthenos. And Parthenos indicates that it's Athena the Virgin or Athena the Maiden. So that's kind of the version of Athena that's being worshipped inside the temple that we call the Parthenon. This is also the largest structure on top of the Acropolis, and you can tell here looking at this what we're dealing with is a Doric-style temple because of these bowl-shaped capitals. The column itself sits right on the platform, and we've got these kind of triglyphs and metopes around the top of the temple. And then finally, we get this weird building over here, and this is what we call the ERECHTHEION. It's a very weird temple. You'll notice it's like not got that kind of classical form where it's just columns all around the outside. We've got some columns, then we've got a solid wall. We've got these other kind of columns here. We call these caryatids. This is kind of the most famous part of the ERECHTHEION. And the caryatids are columns that have actually been carved into the form of a person. So you can see these are all women that are kind of serving as both sculpture and a kind of architecturally functional use of holding up the roof here. Now this is dedicated to one of the very, very early kings of Athens, this guy Erechtheus. But it's also the site of the contest for Athens. And this is where Athena and Poseidon both kind of compete to become the patron god or goddess of the city. And in that contest, the way that the person's going to win is by giving the best gift to the Athenians. So Poseidon goes first, and he smashes his trident into the ground right inside the temple here, and out spurts all this water. And he's thinking, this is great, people need water to live. But Poseidon maybe wasn't the smartest god. And of course the water that spurts out here is not fresh water, but salt water, which they can't really do a lot with. Athena, on the other hand, gives them the olive tree. And you can still see the modern descendant of that olive tree, the only tree on the Acropolis, right here next to the Erechtheion. And from that, people get olives for food, olive oil for food, and for fuel. Olive oil that they use for hygiene as well. An incredibly useful plant in a diversity of ways. And so Athena wins that contest and becomes the patron goddess of the city, right? And actually gives her name to the city itself. And so again, we can see kind of an overview of the Acropolis, the high point of the city right here, with the PROPYLAEA, the Temple of Athena Nike, the massive kind of Parthenon up here, and then the Erechtheion over here. So, in addition to architecture, we also see developments in the realm of pottery. And so in the Archaic period, we see the development of Corinthian pottery, right? These kind of Near Eastern motifs becoming a little bit kind of more Greek here with classical Corinthian style pottery. But then we also see the development of Athenian black figure at the end of the Archaic period in the 6th century BC. That's when kind of the whole thing is slipped in black, and then the background is etched away. That gives it the orange color of the clay, and the figures are left in black slip. What we see during the classical period is what we call the development of Athenian red figure. And that's when the opposite is done, right? So the whole thing is slipped in black, and then the figures themselves are etched away to show the color of the clay, while the background now is still covered in that kind of shiny black slip. We also get the development of classical Greek drama. And so this becomes a big part of kind of ancient Greek religious festivals. So along with the religious festival, you have kind of a drama or theater festival as well, very frequently in honor of the god Dionysus. And when we think of this for the ancient Greek world, there are essentially two different types of plays. We've got tragedies. And what tragedies do, they tell the story very frequently of the gods. So tragedies are set in the realm of the gods, and they very frequently teach some sort of lesson and have a not so happy ending. Then we've also got comedies. And comedies are really interesting in the sense that they are set in everyday life in the ancient Greek world. And they comment on the major issues of the day. And this is a way that playwrights and the citizens of particular city-states can voice their kind of displeasure with the way that things are going on. So in a famous example known as the Lysistrata by the playwright Aristophanes, the playwright is giving a commentary on the Peloponnesian War. We'll hear about that a little bit later. But he's not very happy with the way the war is going. He doesn't think that Athens should be a part of this war. And he writes this play about how the women of Athens go on strike from having sex with their men. And they are going to be on strike from that until the men decide to stop fighting. And so it's this really cool thing where in the Near East, where we've got these massive empires, right? We've got a monarch ruling everything, and what he says goes. In the Greek world, we've got people voicing their displeasure with the way things are going, with the way government's doing things. And that kind of freedom of speech, which is expressed through theater here, is a really important development of ancient Greece. Things are going awesome, right? The Greek world is crushing it in the 5th century BC. What could possibly go wrong? Well, let's talk about that. So, we've got a little bit of fallout from the wars of 480. So remember, in Sicily, we get the Battle of Himera, where the Greeks defeat the Carthaginians. And then in mainland Greece, we see the Athenians and Spartans team up to defeat the Persians at the Battle of Salamis, and then also at Plataea and Mycale. Now, in Sicily, what's happened is that Syracuse has become the dominant city-state. They are almost ruling that entire island like a capital city. But in mainland Greece, we get this kind of division of power. So on land, the Spartans are dominant. The Spartan kind of phalanx army is still the dominant force on the Greek mainland. But at sea, remember it was the Athenian navy that was able to lead the way at the Battle of Salamis. The Athenian navy is kind of dominant at sea. And so we've still got kind of a struggle for power between these two city-states. And remember, that was going on right before the war with the Persians as well. Now, one of the things that we can see that's a little bit different between how Sicily operates and mainland Greece is in the dedications after these wars. So in Sicily, one of the things that we get is we get Gelon, the tyrant of Syracuse, the leader of Syracuse, dedicate a tripod to the god Apollo afterwards, kind of thanking him for victory. And he just puts right on there, this tripod is from Gelon of Syracuse. Thanks for the victory. Now, Athens ends up doing something similar. They also dedicate a tripod to the god Apollo, thanking them for the victory at Salamis. But rather than some individual person of Athens putting their name on it, it simply says, thank you, Apollo, from these 31 city-states who got together to defeat the Persians. And so here is this kind of collective where they're giving credit to all the different city-states who have participated. Over in Sicily, it's one guy saying, hey, thanks, I am pretty great. At the height of his power, Gelon of Syracuse ends up dying, and his son Hero takes over. All right? Now, this is kind of interesting in the sense that this is almost moving away from a tyrant who seizes power to a monarchy where single power is inherited over time. And that happens just after the Battle of Himera. And what Hero ends up doing is essentially kind of ruling like a king, right? Like an Eastern kind of monarch, where he's installing different family members in different city-states and still kind of basically trying to put his stamp on any other city-state in Sicily. Now, after 20 or so years, the Sicilians get sick of this, and they throw out the tyrants. And they do this using something called the Common Resolution, where the tyrants of Syracuse are disbanded. And what this means is that around 460, this happened in 461 BC, democracy takes over on the island of Sicily, and now it's a very prevalent form of government, both in Magna Graecia in southern Italy and in Sicily, as well as in mainland Greece. So democracy is becoming really big. So we get rid of our Sicilian tyrants, and we're in with democracy. Okay, now, as this happens, these Western Greeks from Magna Graecia and Sicily are becoming incredibly wealthy. So they are growing tons of wine, they're selling it to the Carthaginians, they're growing tons of grain, they're selling it to the Greek mainland cities like Athens and Sparta, whose hinterlands aren't that great for agriculture. And they're using the wealth to build massive amounts of temples, right? So this is the site of Silenus. We saw them team up earlier with the Carthaginians against some of the other Greek city-states. But we can see just how many temples they've got. Here's a massive Greek temple. Here's the remains of a massive Greek temple. Here's the remains of another massive Greek temple. They are getting really wealthy from selling their agricultural produce. Now, over in the Eastern Mediterranean, near the Greek mainland, the Aegean Sea, Athens is gaining control. So they are using that fleet to essentially bring in grain. So they're using kind of the fleet that they have left over from the Persian Wars to distribute grain, to sell grain, that sort of thing. The other thing that they're doing is that they are still charging kind of like a tax on all these different city-states to use this fleet for protection. So they're going around, sailing around, selling grain, and saying, hey, we're going to protect you from the Persians as long as you pay us some money. And so Athens is getting really, really wealthy off of this as well, and they form something known as the Delian League that kind of is centered on the sacred island of Delos. Athens is the head of this. This is the closest Athens is getting to a real kind of empire. Now, when this happens, Sparta's starting to get like a little bit wary of what's going on with the Athenians. And so they see Athens start this kind of Delian League, start to ally themselves with different city-states that used to be loyal to Sparta. And that's exactly what Athens is trying to do. They're trying to become the preeminent power, not by fighting Sparta, but rather by trying to like steal their allies. And this works to some extent. Some of them come over to the Athenian side. They're never able to get Corinth, which is kind of like the big prize, so it never totally succeeds. But we see this kind of Cold War struggle between Athens and Sparta over who their allies are. Now, in 449 BC, what we get is something known as the Peace of CLAS. And what this does is it kind of officially brings to an end the Persian Wars. Now this sounds great, right? Greece is officially done with fighting Persia. This should like keep the classical age, the golden age going for quite a while. But instead it actually has a kind of negative effect, because the city-states that had been paying money to Athens start to ask themselves, why are we doing this, right? Why are we paying for protection if the war is over? And as a result, they start to revolt. So the region of Boeotia revolts, the region of EUBOEA revolts, the region of MEGARA revolts against Athens. And what Sparta is doing when this is going on is they're ready to seize this opportunity to invade Athens and try to become the preeminent power in mainland Greece. Now, luckily for the Athenians, they see a new leader arise, a guy by the name of Pericles. And what Pericles is able to do is he's able to go reconquer the region of EUBOEA, so he's able to calm that revolt, and then he's able to sign a treaty with the Spartans, and we call this the 30 Years' Peace. And so this calms things down. It allows Athens to kind of go around and start putting down those revolts and collecting taxes once again. And now when they do it, they actually do it a little differently. Instead of just putting down the revolt, they also start taking over the political institutions of the city-states that have revolted. And so now Athens is really, really honestly becoming an empire, physically taking over the political institutions of other independent city-states. So as he's doing this, right, Athenian power is spreading all around the kind of Mediterranean through what they call the Delian League. But it's really Athens kind of very forcefully exerting their power. For example, they can only use Athenian weights and measures. They can only use Athenian harbors. And they're basically making foreign policy decisions for these other city-states. This creates a situation where everybody starts getting nervous. So we saw how powerful those tyrants in Sicily were and how wealthy the Sicilian Greeks are getting. And that makes the Athenians really nervous. So the Athenians are really nervous of the Sicilian Greeks. And so they start expanding in their Delian League, collecting these taxes. But their kind of political power and military power and economic power expansion, well, that's really frightening the Spartans. And so the Spartans are scared of the Athenians, and the Athenians are scared of the Sicilians. And even though culturally, with architecture and art, things are going really, really well during the classical period, these tensions have certainly arisen. So, a few concluding thoughts. So, for one, right, we get the rise of wonderful things during the classical period, like this kind of classical Greek philosophy. beautiful, fluid, realistic marble sculptures. We've got architecture reaching its peak with things like the Parthenon. And we've got drama, allowing people to express their concerns about the way government's being able to run. But even though these wonderful things are all happening during the classical period in the 5th century in Greece, we also get the rise of tensions, with the Athenians being kind of scared of the Sicilians and the Spartans being scared of the Athenians. And we'll see how that ends up playing out in actual military conflict that brings a very kind of short end to this golden age of 5th century Greece. So that's kind of how we conceptualize classical Greece and what we think of when we think of the golden age.